If you went through an American high school, you probably heard some version of this. Saladin was the noble one, the merciful one, the leader who, after defeating the Crusaders, showed more honor than the Christians ever showed him. The textbook version of this story holds him up as proof that the medieval Islamic world was capable of a restraint the West couldn't match. That claim is built on real events, selectively read, and the sources that get left out don't support it. The people who were there, the men who wrote down what happened in Arabic, for Muslim audiences, with no interest in flattering the Crusaders, recorded something the curriculum doesn't mention. When the myth and the record don't match, one of them has to give. The standard American high school framing of Saladin runs something like this. He was a unifier, a statesman, a warrior who fought with principle. Where the Crusaders massacred the population of Jerusalem when they took the city in 1099, Saladin spared the city's inhabitants when he recaptured it in 1187. That contrast is the center of the lesson, and it's used to draw a conclusion about character. The framing isn't invented. Saladin did spare Jerusalem's population. That happened. But the curriculum takes that single act and uses it to define the whole man. And that's where the selective reading begins. This version of Saladin didn't start in a classroom. It started in 18th century Europe, when Enlightenment writers, looking for a counterpoint to church authority, reached back into the medieval world and found him useful. A noble Muslim commander made for a convenient argument against religious fanaticism closer to home. Walter Scott's writing did more to cement this image in the Western imagination than any actual chronicle. By the 20th century, post-colonial guilt gave the narrative a second wind, and by the time it reached the modern curriculum, it had traveled so far from the primary sources that the men who actually knew Saladin would barely recognize the figure being described. What gets cited in support of this version are the accounts of his mercy. What doesn't get cited is Imad ad-Din al-Isfahani's description of the days after Hattin. That omission is not an accident. It changes everything. July 4th, 1187, the Crusader army marched into a trap on the horns of a basalt plateau above the Sea of Galilee, cut off from water, surrounded, and destroyed. By the end of that day, the Kingdom of Jerusalem had effectively ceased to exist as a military force. Guy of Lusignan, the Crusader king, was captured. So were the Grand Masters and Knights of the Templar and Hospitaller orders, the two military brotherhoods that formed the professional backbone of Crusader resistance. What happened next is where Saladin's own secretary becomes the most important voice in the room. Imad ad-Din al-Isfahani was not a Crusader chronicler writing to make Christians look sympathetic. He was an Arab scholar, Saladin's personal secretary, a man who traveled with the army and wrote for a Muslim readership that expected accurate accounts of a great victory. He had no reason to invent suffering, no reason to flatter the defeated, and no political motive to make his commander look anything other than justified. He wrote down what he saw because he believed what he saw was right. What he recorded is this. After the battle, Saladin separated the captured Templars and Hospitallers from the other prisoners. Guy of Lusignan was treated well, offered drink, eventually ransomed. The military orders received no such consideration. Saladin ordered their execution, and then, according to Imad ad-Din, he sat and watched as Sufi scholars and volunteers from the army carried it out. The men doing the killing were not soldiers finishing a battle. They were religious figures, some of them clumsy with blades, taking turns. Imad ad-Din describes the scene without horror because in his framework it required none. Ibn al-Athir, another Muslim historian writing in the same period, confirms the same sequence. Two independent Arabic sources, both writing from within the Islamic world, both recording the same deliberate act. This isn't a Crusader exaggeration. This is the Muslim historical record. Saladin's reasoning is also documented. These men, the Templars and Hospitallers, were the most capable and committed fighters in the Crusader military system. They didn't defect, they didn't negotiate, and they couldn't be trusted to stay ransomed. Releasing them meant fighting them again. Executing them meant removing them permanently from a conflict Saladin understood in religious and civilizational terms, not just tactical ones. That reasoning is coherent. It follows a logic, but it is not the logic of the merciful, chivalrous figure the textbook describes. It's the logic of a commander who understood that certain enemies couldn't be absorbed into the normal medieval calculus of ransom and release, and who acted accordingly with deliberate intent. After the fighting was over, while watching. The executions at Hattin weren't a battlefield necessity. They were a policy, announced in advance and carried out in sequence. Mercy was extended to Guy because Guy's survival was useful. Mercy was not extended to the military orders because their survival was a liability. The distinction is documented, it's consistent, and it appears in sources that had every reason to approve of what Saladin did. The textbook never mentions any of this. It goes straight from Hattin to Jerusalem, and the story it tells about Jerusalem is true, but it's being asked to carry the weight of a character judgment that the full record doesn't support. So why does the textbook version survive? The Jerusalem story is easier to teach. A commander who spares a city fits neatly into a lesson about tolerance and moral progress. A commander who orders the methodical execution of prisoners, while religious scholars take turns with the blade, does not. So one story gets included and the other gets dropped, and the version that remains is then presented as a portrait of the man. The problem isn't that the Jerusalem account is false, it's that it's being used to do work it can't support on its own. Raymond Ibrahim, who has written extensively on how Islamic sources read differently when you're not filtering them through a modern humanitarian lens, makes a point worth sitting with. Saladin wasn't inconsistent. He wasn't merciful in Jerusalem and brutal at Hattin, because he was complicated in the way modern readers like to imagine. He was operating inside a coherent framework where mercy and elimination were both tools applied according to what a given situation demanded politically and religiously. That's not contradiction. That's strategy with a theological foundation. Look at the pattern across his campaigns. And the logic holds. Populations that surrendered and could be absorbed were spared, because consolidating territory required stable civilian populations. Fighters who represented an organized, ideologically committed opposition to Islamic rule were removed, because leaving them in place meant fighting them again and again and again. The Templars and Hospitallers were the clearest example of that second category. They weren't just soldiers. They were institutions, built specifically to prosecute a religious war, with no interest in assimilation and no history of staying defeated. Saladin's decision at Hattin wasn't a departure from his character. It was an expression of it. What the American curriculum is actually doing, when it builds its lesson around Jerusalem, is importing a 21st century moral vocabulary onto a 12th century commander who didn't share it, and wouldn't have recognized it. Saladin wasn't trying to be humane in a modern sense. He was trying to win a war he understood as a religious obligation, and he made decisions accordingly. Judging him by the standards of contemporary humanitarian law, and then celebrating him for passing the test, is not history. It's projection dressed up as a lesson. The deepest problem with getting this wrong isn't that it's unfair to the Crusaders or flattering to Saladin. It's that it prevents you from understanding what the conflict actually was. When you misread why Saladin made the decisions he made, you misread the entire structure of the confrontation, what each side believed, what they were fighting for, and why neither side experienced the war the way a modern student is taught to interpret it. The sources that record Hattin's aftermath aren't hostile witnesses. They're men who admired Saladin, who served him, who wrote his victories down for posterity. They didn't describe the execution of the military orders as a stain on his record. They described it as a righteous act. The historical Saladin was a capable, ruthless, religiously motivated commander who made deliberate choices within a specific worldview. The textbook Saladin is a projection of what we want the past to look like. They are not the same man. The sources written by Saladin's own contemporaries, including his own secretary, don't support the myth American students are taught. If you want to see the gap for yourself, find Imad ad-Din al-Isfahani's account of Hattin or Ibn al-Athir's chronicle, and read what they actually wrote. Then go back to whatever your textbook said. The distance between those two readings is the distance between history and a lesson plan. If you want more of this channel's approach, built from primary sources rather than modern projections, the next video goes further into how the Crusades get misread at the civilizational level. That one is worth watching before you form a conclusion.